Welcome everyone to the ninth annual Big Sioux River Water Summit. In an effort to keep things rolling, we'll move right along to the presentation, and we'll begin with Gary Benshrop. Gary is a U.S. Forest Service Research Landscape Planner at the USDA National Agroforestry Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. He received a Bachelor of Landscaping Architecture from Kansas State University and a Master of Landscape Architecture from Utah State University. His work focuses on developing resources for designing multifunctional agroforestry practices that address landowner and public goals. Gary, you have the floor.
Thanks, Troy, and good afternoon, everybody. Excited to be part of this water summit, and looking over the agenda, I really wish I could be there in person, but we'll just make do with the virtual world. So jumping into the presentation, a little bit of an outline. I'm going to just kind of describe what our center does, the National Agroforestry Center, a little bit about agroforestry. But most of the talk, I want to focus on two tools that we have developed that I think could be useful for folks working on water quality and stewardship issues on the Big Sioux River. And then I'll also mention a few other tools that the National Agroforestry Center has developed. The National Agroforestry Center, as Troy mentioned, the center is based in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we're a partnership between U.S. Forest Service Research and Development, state and private forestry, as well as the Natural Resource Conservation Service. We're a small center, but we do also have an office, or a person, I should say, in Burlington, Vermont. So maybe just to set the stage on agroforestry, agroforestry is simply a management system that combines agriculture and trees to address production and conservation needs. Many of you, I'm sure, are pretty familiar with some of the common practices in the region and in South Dakota, and this would be windbreaks and also riparian forest buffers. There are other practices such as alley cropping, forest farming, and silvopasture that are practiced in other parts of the United States. And this map shows the results from the 2017 Census of Ag of how many farms report at least one agroforestry practice. And the darker blue indicates a higher number. Kind of zeroing in a little bit on South Dakota, here is a map showing the number of farms with at least one agroforestry practice in South Dakota. And we don't know what practices these are necessarily, because the survey question did not go into that detail. But we can probably speculate again that they're focused on probably riparian forest buffers or windbreaks. And we can kind of see the Big Sioux River in red is kind of going through some of the counties with a higher number of farms with agroforestry practices. And so probably there is a bit of riparian buffers already being utilized by farmers and others in this watershed. And the map to the right kind of is an aerial view of the Big Sioux in your area. And I want to use this to kind of talk just a little bit about buffers and how they're valuable, but we don't want to think that they are overstate their usefulness. And I'll explain a little bit. They're part of one tool in the toolbox. But when we look at this landscape, we can kind of see that riparian buffer zone along the Big Sioux, as well along some of the tributaries. And that vegetation provides a lot of benefits, particularly from a water quality point of view. It allows runoff to be filtered, reducing pollution getting into the channel, as well as it attenuates floods during flood events. But we also know on this landscape that there are pathways that short circuit water going to the river so that it doesn't flow through these buffers. Roadside ditches, canals, culverts, and other things allow water to kind of get into these water systems rather than always flowing through these riparian zones. So it's just an acknowledgement that we have to think maybe more comprehensively and think about how I like to use the term buffers both upland and riparian buffers. So when we look across this landscape, we can see other areas that aren't in riparian zones that could still be perennial vegetation that accomplishes other environmental stewardship goals, including water quality, providing areas where you can filter polluted runoff and help mediate that. And ultimately, what we're shooting for is trying to build resilient landscapes. This is no surprise as we're experiencing more extreme weather events. It's kind of like we're rolling the dice. One year it's going to be droughts, and the next year it seems it's going to be floods. And when we kind of hedge our bets with only monoculture systems, and particularly annual systems, they're a little bit more vulnerable to these disturbances. And when we look at kind of a perennial-based system, we are able to get maybe a little bit more of a mix and balance of different production and environmental stewardship benefits. And that's kind of what these slides indicate here. So with that background, I'd now like to move into talking about the two tools in particular to discuss today. And the first one is when we're thinking about trying to do plantings for whatever environmental purposes or production purposes, then most of the information that is available is based on plant characteristics and site requirements. Does the species grow well on a silty clay loam? Or does the species have a fall color that's desirable? When we think about purpose or function-based information, this information is a little bit more limited and harder to come by. For instance, does the species function well in a windbreak or as a riparian forest buffer? And then when we dive deeper, it's usually these species aren't necessarily shown how well they compare to other species for that purpose. They're not ranked. So you don't know, is species A better than species B? And so one of my colleagues back a number of years ago decided to try to embark on a function-based tool. And this would be a ratings developed on plant attributes or traits. And that this ultimately would support multifunctional design. So we could kind of use this tool to decide if the species is good for polluted runoff treatment, as well as is it good for wildlife, and look at what species kind of come out to be the best for those particular two functions. So the tool we came up with is called Tree Advisor, and it's useful trees and shrubs for the Great Plains. And right now, this tool is focused basically starting kind of at the Kansas, a little bit of Oklahoma, and going toward the Canadian border, kind of from the eastern side of North Dakota, South Dakota, over into a little bit Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And so I want to walk through this tool and how it might be used. First, it's based on the USDA plant hardiness zones, as you can see in this picture here. And what we did is we divided this hardiness zone east to west by precipitation zones, because precipitation also really dictates what species are going to grow in a particular area or subregion. So there's 12 subregions in this tool. There's over 90 woody species included in this tool, both shrubs and tree species. Predominantly native species, but there is also introduced or non-native species that are not invasive, because they can still play a role for certain functions if they're placed in the appropriate location. As mentioned, it's a rating tool. It's not making the decision for you. So it doesn't say this is the plant you should plant. It just gives you recommendations. These plants are going to be better for that particular function. Hence the term advisor. It's also not a site-specific tool, because one will still need to know on your particular site what kind of soils you have, what kind of moisture regime you have, in order to determine which species will ultimately go into a particular project. And of course, this is a prototype and we're working on improving it as we go along. The foundation of this tool is built on the plant attributes. And there's over 25 different attributes or traits in this trait database. And there are things such as the morphology and growth characteristics of species, such as crown size, height, is it nitrogen fixing? There's also environmental tolerances and a few others I'll show you on the next slide. Now, some of these are kind of try to be on a quantitative basis. So for crown height, we broke out this into 3 ratings, or not ratings, codes. So short shrubs, anything under 6-7 feet. 2 short trees or tall shrubs, 70 to 30 feet. And then tall trees. And so these numbers will be used in our rating algorithms, which I'll show in just a few minutes. Some of the attributes are a little bit more subjective, so such as shade tolerance. So here it is, if a species just does not grow at all in shade, that would get a 1. If it's moderate, it gets a 2. And if it can do very well under shade, it gets a 3. And that's how these codes were developed. Also included are some other additional environmental risk, wildlife benefits, potential economic products, and visual aesthetics. And so this is the foundation. And so in this tool, there are 14 purposes that are rated. And this list is not meant to be inclusive, but just a starting point for common reasons people plant trees and shrubs in the region to achieve some benefits. This includes an agroforestry practice of valley cropping, aquatic habitat, things such as stream bank stabilization, wildlife habitat. Maybe it's going to be a visual and noise screen. And all these are rated on a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest. And most of these ratings are based on 3 to 5 attributes in an algorithm. So to walk through one of these, we'll pick the polluted runoff treatment. Again, probably the most important one from a water quality point of view. And so what does vegetation actually do to help improve the water quality? And so the vegetation provides surface roughness that slows down the overland flow. This allows infiltration. It also promotes deposition of the sediment and sediment-bound pollutants like phosphorus when it's bound. Infiltration of dissolved pollutants, which is really important because dissolved pollutants will otherwise just kind of really keep flowing across the landscape unless they infiltrate. This also vegetation allows uptake and sequestration of nutrients by plants and the transformation of these nutrients and degradation of pesticides by soil microorganisms. So to work through an algorithm, one of the first attributes used in the polluted runoff treatment is stand form. And this represents is a species kind of growing as a usually single stem, like a common tree, or is it more clonal or thicket forming, like a lot of our shrubs or some of our dogwoods? For some of these attributes, they're weighted. If their evidence or research suggests that it is so important, it should be weighted a little higher than the others. In this particular example, they're all weighted equally. The next one is shade density. And what we're looking for here is a plant that casts minimal shade, with the idea that we want a good understory of vegetation, forbs, grasses, and whatnot that will provide that surface roughness that will filter water as it's running across the landscape. Water use, we want species that have high water use. This will help dry out the soil and encourage infiltration, as well as we want species that are fast growing. They will take up most nutrients at a higher rate and help sequester some of the pollutants and transformation. So these get transformed into a rating algorithm and it's normalized along a base 10 system. So let's take a look at the polluted runoff treatment, and we'll pick zone 4E, which is where Sioux Falls is located. And we can see that some of the top species recommended for this function are willow species. Other ones can include elderberry, silverberry, and golden currant. The table at the bottom kind of helps illustrate how these rankings kind of sorted out and where the overall number ended. So the Bebb's willow was rated a 9, and you can see where the numbers were, why it ended up with a 9. Where hackberry only ended up with a 5 and really isn't necessarily recommended as a suitable species for the polluted runoff treatment. And this is because it's a single stem formed and its water use is a lot lower than a willow. Well, here's the interface of the tool, and you can pick 2 purposes at a time. The primary purpose and then a secondary purpose, which will be rated against the primary ones. So in this example, we have a polluted runoff filter and then flood protection. And you can see the species that came out high for these 2 functions. If you're interested in additional purposes, you could do another simple run of the tool and get another set of species. And then you can crosswalk the 2 together and kind of see, like, sandbar willow is actually a top species for all 4 of these functions. In a way, you could develop a species list that then you can take and determine, are they appropriate for your actually specific site conditions. And this tool is supported with help information and PDFs that describe all the algorithms and other information behind it as online. And this tool is, like I said, an online tool. I'd like to now move on to another tool called the Conservation Buffer Guide. And this tool came out a number of years ago, back in about 2008. And it's a little handbook based on over 1,400 research publications. And this developed over 80 illustrated design guidelines for these functions on the left. Everything from improving air and water quality, protecting soil, wildlife habitat, economic productivity, recreational opportunities, and beautifying the landscape. So here's a couple pages from it in the water quality section. So there's information on where to target buffers and watersheds for the most benefit from water quality, how to start to design these in terms of where the pollution source is and how to design that. If you're working with maybe shallow groundwater and what effect buffers can have on shallow groundwater pollution, here are design considerations and planning considerations to take into account. Here's some examples from the biodiversity section. This summarizes the research on edge effects of corridors, whether it's an open corridor through a woodland or whether it's a woodland corridor in a more open crop or grassland landscape. The little diagram on the right shows kind of the synthesis of the research on how wide buffers need to be for different wildlife guilds or groups. And then finally, another example of some of the guidelines around recreation and how to do trails around riparian corridors, also how to consider buffers and spade drift, and how wide these buffers might need to be to minimize detrimental effects on aquatic. This guide's available in English, and if you're also interested in brushing up on your other language skills, it's available in Spanish, French, Korean, Chinese, and Mongolian. This tool has been out over 10 years, and we're going to be launching an effort in 2022 to update this guide based on the latest research that has come out. And that'll probably be available in about probably 2 years. And to finish up, just a couple other tools and resources that we have at the National Agroforestry Center. We've got a variety of tech notes, little simple information sheets that are great with working with landowners on riparian buffers as well as other agroforestry practices. We've also consolidated a agroforestry webinar library. This has over about 180 webinars done by people across the country. And you can sort this by practice. And we've got about 25 webinars on just riparian forest buffers that you can review and watch. And so I'll wrap it up there, and hopefully we've got some time for any questions. And thank you for your attention. And I'll maybe stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Gary. We will open it up for any questions for Gary here, and let him take a few minutes here. We got about 10 minutes left for any questions you have for Gary. That should be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very nice presentation. I had a question. One of the variables was stormwater. How applicable would this tool be for riparian buffers in urban or suburban areas?
Yeah, I think that one is very applicable because it's really still, it's not so much based on the land use as much as, again, the primary functions that the vegetation is going to provide. It's got some similar attributes as the polluted runoff treatment one, but it would be, I think, a good starting point for looking at suitable tree and shrub species for urban stormwater management.
Any other questions? I think you got off easy, Gary. Thank you for taking the time here today, and hopefully you can stay on for a couple other presentations. But we appreciate you logging on here and giving your little talk.
No problem. My pleasure, and hope everybody else enjoys the rest of the summit.
Thank you, Gary. All right. It is 2:10. We'll keep things rolling here, and we'll introduce our next presenter. Dr. John Mcmain is an assistant professor and water management engineer, extension state specialist in the agricultural and biosystem engineering department at South Dakota State University. He received his PhD in biosystem engineering from Oklahoma State University. He received Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in biosystems and agricultural engineering from the University of Kentucky. His research and outreach interests center around agricultural and urban water management and water quality. In his current role, he researches water management and technologies that are environmentally and economically sustainable and provides guidance for stakeholders to implement practices that improve water management and water quality. John, you have the floor. Here's your clicker.
Thank you, Troy. Very good. Okay, so as Troy said, my name is John. I work at SDSU. I'm from Kentucky originally. The accent comes out sometimes on some certain words, but I don't think I could pass for a Midwesterner per se, but I don't think I have a huge accent. Anyways, we're not here today to talk about my accent. We're here today to talk about water. That is the Big Sioux River Water Summit after all. And specifically this presentation is going to deal with water quantity. Okay, we talk a lot about water quality, which is very important, but this is going to deal with water quantity, which has pretty direct implications to water quality as well. This is a project that's funded by the NRCS, their Conservation Collaboration Grant, and it is in partnership with many other entities, which we'll get to, but we titled it, academics, they like long titles, right? So it could be shorter. I don't know how it'd be shorter. I need to talk with someone who's good at writing short titles. But anyway, Roadmap to Resilience. So we're going to get into it, but we think about water. It seems like we never have the right amount at the right time. It's either too much, too early, or not enough later on, whatever. So really what we're looking to do is optimize when, how much for our specific purposes. So kicking off with some acknowledgements. the team, both the graduate students and staff that work with me, and then some members of the project team in the bottom right on a sunny day in July. And then this is actually from last night's.
Sorry.
No worries. Shout out to Kristen. That's Kristen, but yeah, okay. So Kristen is the project coordinator for this and really makes sure a lot of the stuff gets done. So big shout out to her. Also, it's exciting because a lot of times we end up working on projects that are either environmentally focused or agricultural focused. And we feel very, I don't know if proud is the right word, but very happy that this project definitely covers the gamut from kind of agricultural interest groups to environmental interest groups. Proving, well, I don't know if it proves anything, but we're excited about that. And then a shameless plug, we have a podcast, Streamlines, it's on the extension website. This has nothing to do with the presentation. But if you like selfies of us doing field work, you can follow me on Twitter. Okay, and then here's a list of some of the people involved. And now let's get to the good stuff. Okay, 2019. I don't know if this is the good stuff or not, but 2019, this is all of the reasons for crop insurance claims in the state of South Dakota. 2019 was one of the wettest years on record, so no surprise, the number one cause at over 60% of the crop insurance claims was due to excess moisture. This includes both prevent plant in spring as well as kind of flooding throughout the growing season. But 2019 is actually an anomaly because I did this, I don't have it on this presentation, but 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017, the last 4 years, 2019 is the only one that has only one of the moisture extremes as one of the leading causes of crop insurance. We don't expect this trend to change. We don't expect this to necessarily get better, even though 2021 was a dry year, but we've seen increased moisture on an annual basis since 1990. So this is a study that Dr. Chris Hay and Dr. Dennis Toddy did, and it's about 10 years old now, 2011. I actually showed this very same map last year when I talked, but it's still relevant today. What you see here, this is the change in annual precipitation from that first 30-year stretch to the second 20-year stretch. So from 1960 to 1990, comparing to 1990 and 2009. And these really dark blue spots, that's where average annual precipitation has gone up by 4 inches. The really dark one over here in Northeast Iowa, it's 5 or greater. But for the most part, eastern South Dakota, eastern North Dakota, and then kind of this western Minnesota part is 2 to 3 to 4 inches higher annually in that second stretch compared to the first stretch. We're also seeing more intense events, and then the timing is changing. And 2 or 3 or 4 inches of rain or precipitation, that may not sound like a lot, but when your baseline is 22 inches or 23 inches, that's in excess of 10% more rain each year. So where does that rain go? That rain has to go somewhere, right? So that's why we think about water excess. But the timing is also changing. Believe it or not, there's not a lot of evaporation in the winter, the fall. There's not a lot of what we call transpiration, or the amount of water that the plants use and take back to the atmosphere. And so timing makes a big difference too, right? Even if we have enough water, we don't get it at the right time. It's still a problem for water deficit. And so that leads me back to crop insurance claims. 2018, also a wet year, right? So number one, excess moisture, almost or over 30%, excuse me. But number two is drought, the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So you have the same state, the same year, too much water and not enough water. So it's not necessarily about amount, but timing matters too. Flip the script, 2017, drought. It was a dry year. So drought, no surprise, the leading cause of crop insurance claims. But number two, excess moisture. And so some of this is related to variability throughout the state. right? The western part of South Dakota tends to be drier than the eastern part of South Dakota. But I just did a quick scan and sorted this data by county, and we saw the same county even, some of this pattern emerge as well. So even same county, same year, we had both extremes which were causing issues. So that was kind of at the field scale. But then we think about the watershed scale. And flooding, obviously, especially in 2019, significant issues. So $32 million almost damage in South Dakota townships in 2019. You think about townships. Townships do not have a large tax base. Catastrophic events could set a township back years if they have to deal with significant culvert repairs, bridge repairs, all those types of things. And so while we think of, I mean, these, that makes a, I don't want to say a great picture, but it's a very dramatic picture. If we look Sioux Falls, right? We have flooding, we have lots of businesses, we have cars. But if you think about a simple culvert getting taken out, maybe 1 year, 2 year, 3 years in a township, that's a pretty significant burden that township has to bear. And so it's not just an issue for large cities, the Sioux Falls and the Minneapolises and the Omahas, but it's also an issue for the Hartfords and the Milbanks and the Parkers. And so that brings us to the question of if we can get rid of this bar up here at the top. That's the question.
Yeah, I was trying to. Oh.
Maybe that's what you're trying to do.
Well, this.
All right, well done.
There, I think we got it.
Round of applause for Troy. Yay, Troy.
Hopefully it's still recording audio, but we'll just say it is.
He's the real MVP. All right, so that brings to the second question, after we figured out how to get rid of the bar, was how much do conservation practices, how much difference do they make to reduce soil moisture risk in the field? And by soil moisture risk, we're defining this as too much or too little, right? Because we're dealing with both these situations. And then if we deal with the field, if we manage our soil moisture better in the field, can we reduce flooding, or can we improve kind of the hydrology of the watershed to reduce flooding as well as water supply when we get to a year like 2021? And so we embarked on a 3-year study to answer these questions and more. We're working in the Willow Creek watershed. This is an actual 3-dimensional image of the Willow Creek watershed. That's a joke. This is eastern South Dakota we're talking about here. So no snow-capped mountains, but Willow Creek watershed, which kind of gets into Sioux Falls down here at the bottom. One of our fields, we can see the new Amazon building, and then we get all the way up to just north of the, what's that church up there, Kristen? Willow Creek Church? Yeah, we'll go with that. So that's the watershed that we're working on. And basically the kind of the premise that we're working off of is if we can use soil health practices or soil health approaches to improve water storage in the landscape, right, within the soil, using the soil to maximize what's held in the landscape, then what difference can that make with watershed outlet? So if we start with our baseline condition, and then we either make kind of intermediate change that improves our water holding capacity or our water capture percentage somewhat, well, that reduces our flow down here and coming to Sioux Falls. And then if we get, we go all the way and go all in, well, maybe ideally, potentially, we can see a really dramatic, significant reduction. And just a different way to illustrate this, if we held 2 inches across the Willow Creek watershed, it's about 30,000 acres. That's 1.5 billion gallons of water. And so it's essentially what you have. If this is the baseline condition, you have a storm, that storm is going to overflow. But if we can increase our cup or our jar or whatever to hold more, well, now it's held in the watershed and we don't have the potential flooding downstream. So that's the premise that we're working off of. And now we're setting out to to prove that, and some of the things that we're thinking about is basically all related to soils. And so if we think about how management affects the water balance, how water moves through soil, well, rain falls down and it hits the landscape, right? And so it can either do one of three things. It can run off the surface, can go down to the ground, or it can go back up into the atmosphere as evaporation or transpiration. So we start with that infiltration piece. Bulk density and pore size distribution significantly affect the infiltration capacity of the soil. What affects bulk density? Traffic, or I say traffic, not like traffic on the street, but driving through the field, right? Tillage affects bulk density. The type of crop we have, the amount of crop, the timing of the crop, lots of things can affect bulk density. And same with pore size distribution. Pore size distribution is basically the amount of open space we have in the soil. So if we have a very crushed soil, there's not a lot of space for water to be held in that soil. So once we've gone down into the soil, now there's the opportunity to hold that. And so that would be water holding capacity, and that again is affected by the bulk density as well as the organic matter. Organic matter, I'm not going to use the statistic that NRCS likes to use, but anyway, that's another story. I'm not even sure I brought that up. Anyways, organic matter can significantly increase the water holding capacity of a soil. Percolation. So now that the water's in there, some of it's being held, some of it is moving on through the soil, right? And so if you can get more to move through the soil, well, that's going to alleviate your problem until it hits the water table. And so soil structure, if you have a compacted soil, if you have a plow pan, then that's going to prevent that water from moving on down through the soil. Then evapotranspiration, how much goes back into the atmosphere. And all of these are affected by management. All of these are affected by management. Soils do play a big part, soil texture, which is not something you can easily change. But all of these can be affected by management. And so just an example, kind of as we walk through. So let's say we implement a soil health practice like cover crops or no-till. Well, does that lead to an increase in organic content? We already identified that organic content can increase the water holding capacity. So if we have more organic content, does that hold more water in the soil to kind of help us weather those extremes? And does that give us more moisture in reserve? Does that moisture in reserve lead to a yield increase? And if that yield increase, does that lead to a profit increase? We can answer all these questions, then we can say, how much from a soil moisture perspective does that soil health practice pay because we managed our water better? So that's one of the questions we're trying to answer. And then we're doing a lot of field measurement, a lot of soil moisture monitoring in the field. So right now we have 19 fields where we have these little soil moisture probes stuck into the field. These go down 4 feet. So we're monitoring not only through the root profile, through the root zone, but even below the root zone. There's Amazon over there. So 19 fields, and how we selected these fields is we went for a range of practices. So we have some fields very conventional. So conventional tillage, conventional fertilizer, either corn on corn or corn soybean rotation. So very kind of conventional, traditional agricultural practices you would see in South Dakota. Some we went for long-term no-till. So we have some that have been in no-till for in excess of 15 years. So very established no-till systems. Some we have alfalfa or more perennial crops, and some that we have cover crops in those as well. And so basically what we're trying to do is say, yes, these are in different fields, so we're not per se comparing apples to apples, but we have identified common soil types. So we have soil moisture probes and common soil types across this range of practices. Then the question is, again, through the growing season, how do these different systems manage water? And then there's another question about, okay, once we've identified kind of what works the best, the next question is, are there places that we can incentivize implementation to have the biggest bang for our buck? And what this comes down to is modeling, right? So we build a model of the watershed, excuse me. Build a model of the watershed and identify if we tweak the soil properties in different parts of the watershed, are there some parts that we can tweak it in that it makes a larger difference than other places? So basically, are we getting the best bang for our buck by how we implement conservation? And really, it makes sense. We're investing in this watershed, and so the question is, how can we make our investment dollars go further? And then we also have questions about what drives decision making. And so I talked to a lot of farmers, and a lot of times we'll get to the point of, doesn't make any money. That's an easy excuse to not put in practice, but that's not always an easy reason to put in practice. A lot of practices that don't get implemented, even though it's demonstrated and proven that they make more money. One example is the yield monitor. So the yield monitor has been in since 1990s, early 1990s. Only 30% of farms have a yield monitor that's accurately calibrated. It's demonstrated that you can improve your profitability by knowing what's coming off your field, but only 30% of the farms actually take the extra step to do that calibration. And so there's more than just money that goes into decision making. So we have a social scientist on the team, Dr. Miles Verdizzi, and we're doing surveys in year 1 and year 3, sending it out to every farmer in the watershed. And then within all the fields that we're monitoring, we're also taking detailed economics data. So input costs, output, yield, profitability, those types of things. Because we don't just want to answer the physical science question of how these systems do for water management. We also want to actually get these systems in the ground. Identifying the barriers and the drivers to make that happen. So again, kind of just a recap of what the pieces of the project are. Monitoring soil moisture in individual fields to look at various farming practices, modeling those and the difference that those make at the watershed scale, determining the economic benefit of soil moisture management, but then identifying those social science questions, the barriers, and then modeling the impact of actual implementation. So if we've changed our practices in the watershed, what difference does that make? And so this was year 1 of the project. We kicked off this more or less this spring, monitored for this full year. We had a field tour and a kind of kickoff meeting, but we do plan to go ahead and continue monitoring in 22 and 23, then getting that profitability data for 21, 22, and 23 farmer surveys, year 1 and year 3, doing hydrologic and hydraulic modeling throughout. And then the big picture is, okay, if we can provide benefits at the watershed scale, that's valuable to somebody. And if that causes flooding costs or flooding mitigation costs to go down by $10 or $20 or $500,000, that's now money that can go towards investing in watershed to reduce the potential impacts of flooding and things like that. So that's kind of our big picture of not just what the difference that can be made, but how we can actually get this conservation implemented on scale. So that's yes, Holly.
This was so great. My question is about the methodology of conservation practice. And maybe you mentioned this and maybe I missed it, but you identified the 19 fields, and then are you just studying the current conservation or?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yep. That's a great question. So we knew that we wanted this kind of range of practices, and instead of advising farmers to change or not change, we've gotten that range of practices, and then we're monitoring how those practices do compared against each other, not necessarily compared against a baseline and then an implementation of a conservation practice.
So it's 2019, your first year of,
2021 actually was our first year. Yep. Yep.
and how many fields?
So we have 19 fields. Our objective is 25. We didn't get there because of a combination of timing as well as availability of the soil moisture probes. And we do have 2 sensors in each field. I should have mentioned that. So landscape position affects soil moisture. So we have a upslope and a downslope in each field.
So are these fields statewide, or are you basically East River,
So these are all focused in that Willow Creek watershed.
just in Willow
Yep,
Creek? Okay.
yep. Well, I'm sorry. They're all except for one. We just picked up one this fall that's across the interstate. So it's right next door. Same soil type, but right outside the watershed.
Will you be branching out West River at all?
Not for this project. Yeah, not for this project. Yes. That's, yeah.
I'm curious, in your review and the research you did together, did you see any of these studies happening in other agricultural? And then my second part of the question is, what do you out essentially for conservation?
Yeah. So that's a good those are great questions. There's a very complimentary study that is more or less wrapped up, but they are still doing some analysis in Iowa, the Iowa watershed approach, and they've used 2 separate models. They're also looking at kind of structural or edge of field conservation practices in addition to just landscape change. And so what they found was some of it's hard to get a significant flood reduction unless implemented over a large area, right? Willow Creek watershed is 30,000 acres. I don't know what Skunk Creek or Big Sioux River would be, but they would be multiple times larger than that. So probably what we do in the Willow Creek watershed, if we model that, it's maybe going to make under 5% difference in Sioux Falls, or like in the Big Sioux River. But then if we, yeah, so it's kind of using this as a almost pilot or foundation to say, can we scale this up, and how do we scale this up, and then looking at larger watersheds for implementation. But yeah, there have been some other, in Minnesota has some similar work, but also kind of more focused on water quality. But again, kind of looking at this optimal implementation of conservation for different objectives. Indiana has a kind of similar project, yeah. But yeah.
Just curious, when you found your 19 fields and your 19 farmers, did you have a lot of any turn downs before that, or how did you go about finding those farmers?
Yeah.
Recommendations from local C or?
A lot, yeah. So it was a combination of things, and actually one of the reasons we selected this watershed was there's a few reasons. One is there's a good district conservationist with an RCS there. Darren Rouge is in that area. There's a good conservation district, so the Minnehaha Conservation District, and then there's several farmers that have been active in SDSU research and extension projects before. So there were a lot of existing relationships, and then there's a pretty significant dairy operation there, and so that allows us to get some more perennial crops being monitored, more cover crops, more alternative crops, more extended rotations that aren't as common if the dairy isn't there. So yeah, mainly kind of existing relationships, and then we did working with Minnehaha Farm Bureau. I presented at some of their meetings, and then we invited kind of anyone in the watershed to some kickoff events and things like that. And so, yeah, I'd say mostly existing relationships or word of mouth, but some kind of out of the blue. it's always a little nerve wracking of you say what you're gonna do, you get the money, and then it's like, well, will we get people to actually work with us to, yeah. And it's not 19 farmers, it's probably closer to 9 or 10 farmers, and then some have multiple fields in it, so.
Other questions?
Were you finding more cooperation amongst younger farmers versus older, mid to older aged farmers?
I'd say we're kind of across the board. Kristen, would you say it's pretty well distributed? I mean, because we have a couple young guys, would be. Sorry, definition of young. What's that? Yeah, so I guess, I mean. Yeah, exactly. You're close to Connor possible. But yeah, I'd say 30s, 40s, and then we have some guys that are,
70
yeah, probably late 60s for sure. But it kind of I mean, you think about like the early adopters, if you think about the adoption curve, right? You have 10% of the farmers for any new technique or technology, 10% are going to be the early adopters. You have the bulk of the bell curve is kind of the wait and see folks, and they will likely implement something at some point, but it's going to be 5 or 10 years down the road. Then you have another 10% at the end that's never going to adopt something. And so I'd say our older guys are some of the ones that were like early pioneers in no-till in that area. So they're ones that have already, they've bought into different practices and like are really engaged in that aspect. And so they're like, yeah, I want to participate and, you know, demonstrate how good this system is basically. So, yeah, so they're maybe more prone to try new things anyways. It's maybe not now. They're done trying.
Well, thank you, John.
Thanks, Troy.
Final presentation track here coming up in 10 minutes, and then we'll reconvene in the main ballroom all the way down there for our keynote.
Great.
Cool.
Awesome. Yeah.
So back to your question.
All right, we will continue with our third session of today's summit. And I would like to welcome Holly Meyer. Holly Meyer is the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Sioux Falls. Her work focuses on helping ensure a healthy environment and addressing climate change so our community can thrive today and tomorrow. Currently, Holly's work centers around coordinating the development of the city's Sustainability and Climate Action Plan and starting to implement the actions developed therein. Holly has a master's degree in natural resource science and management from the University of Minnesota. Holly and her husband have 2 daughters, ages 4 and 1. Making sure her girls and all kids and future generations have a beautiful, livable world when they grow up is one of the driving forces behind her work. Please welcome Holly Meyer.
Thank you everyone for being here, especially when you read the longest title in the history of the world that I had made for my presentation. So I was practicing this yesterday and saw the table of all the presentation talks, and I was just horrified at the length. So I had to truncate it. So anyway, here we are, improving water quality and nature-based stormwater management in the city of Sioux Falls. So today I'm going to talk about 3 areas. The first one is the what and the why sustainability. So I'm going to talk about what it means, how we use it for the city, and why it matters, why we need to prioritize it even more than we are. Then I'm going to go into the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, talk a little bit about the plan in general, and then what we've developed for water quality specifically, as well as what we've heard from some community members about water. And then finally, end with some water quality initiatives that we're currently doing as a city and some of the future initiatives that we will be working on that correspond to our plan. All right, so what is sustainability? We are going to start with a little bit of an interactive component. When I talk to audiences, I'm always curious to hear what they think of when they hear the term sustainability. So if anyone wants to offer up how they define it, what they think of, that would be great. Just curious.
Conserving resources.
Conserving resources, great. Great. Well, that's a great one.
Not using resources more than they can be replenished.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so another way that actually I should say, we think about those ways certainly, and we kind of broaden the definition as we use it for the city's work. And for us, we define it as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This definition was created long ago in 1987 by the UN to describe sustainable development, but it still really holds true today, and it's general enough to capture a lot. Really, the core tenets of this definition that I like is the dual orientation on the present and the future. So what's really important with sustainability is that we are making sure, Arlene, like you said, that we're making sure that what we're doing today does not negatively affect future generations who are coming after us, who deserve to have the resources available and to have the quality of life that we have today. Another way to think about sustainability is along the 3 Ps of sustainability. So the 3 pillars are often planet, people, and prosperity. That means that when we're thinking about sustainability, we want to be thinking along these 3 spheres. A lot of times people might think that it's only environmental sustainability, but that's not the case. We want to be thinking about people's well-being and social equity as well. What I do like about this model, though, with the nested figure, as opposed to the Venn diagram where it has everything equal, is that it does showcase that everything kind of ends and begins with the planet piece that kind of shapes everything else. And that indicates that we really are subject to the planetary boundaries that we exist within. And that is really step 1 when we're thinking about our actions today and our actions tomorrow. And then one other thing with sustainability. So this is actually a graphic that's been developed from our sustainability and climate action plan. And this has our 6 focus areas of sustainability for our plan. And the reason why I show this is because it gives an idea of the breadth of issues that sustainability has under its umbrella. So just walking through it, we have community vitality and sustainable living up top. That includes local food access and production. It includes sustainable behavior and individuals' public health. Materials management and waste, going clockwise, that includes our recycling, our materials consumption. Are we consuming materials sustainably? Are we recycling? Are we reducing, etc.? Sustainable economy includes green jobs. It includes sustainable business practices. Energy and buildings, that one is pretty straightforward. Where our energy is coming from? What are our energy sources? And then how are our buildings designed and operating to be the most sustainable possible? Transportation and land use, that includes how we get around in our community and beyond, and then how we are designing our communities and using land resources. And then finally, natural systems. This is really our natural resources. This is water, this is air, this is habitat, native prairie, everything that we consider when we think of natural environment, that's in this sphere. So I think it's important to note that when we're thinking along the full scope of sustainability, it's much broader than just our natural environment. It touches a lot of different things. Okay, so why does it matter? Why do we want to be focusing on sustainability, and why do we want to be prioritizing more? I usually answer with 2 responses, kind of 2 different buckets.
So the first one is that we know that we are facing serious environmental challenges, sustainability issues, climate change, a lot of serious issues that require us to be rethinking and addressing these problems. So, John talked about water quantity. We will be facing those types of changes in the future where we are looking at precipitation changes that will maybe have too little water for a region or too much water for a region at certain times. Hotter temperatures, we are facing air pollution. As we grow as a Sioux Falls community, we will have more cars, and how those are fueled does affect air quality. And then finally, these are some examples of the issues we're facing, but all of these issues from an environmental standpoint affect human health. And I think that's really where the buck stops, where we can really make that tie in more, how we need to address sustainability issues and environmental challenges in order to protect human health. That's one reason why we need sustainability. The other one, beyond solving these issues or addressing these challenges, is being able to reap the many co-benefits of sustainability actions. So this is one of the reasons I love this field, is because there are so many benefits to these types of measures that we are wanting to do. So thinking about renewable energy, there's job creation there. There's, economic growth there. We're thinking about alternative transportation, riding our bikes, walking more. That's good for our health. It's good for to get fresh air, to move our bodies. This bottom left picture is of the Sioux Falls Farmers Market at Falls Park. And not only is growing local food and increasing access to local food beneficial for our health, beneficial for the soil and the environment, but it's beneficial for our community as a whole. Events like this contribute to social cohesion, which we know is a really important factor in community vibrancy. So it's things like that. And then, as we continue to increase renewable energy resources, we gain energy resilience and independence. Two huge benefits of moving toward cleaner energy. So those are the two reasons: to solve problems and then to bring about all these benefits that these types of initiatives bring to us. So the city of Sioux Falls has been working on sustainability formally since about 2009, so over a decade. Prior to that, of course, or the city, prior to my time, had protected natural resources, but formally it was about 2009. And then in 2012, the city created its first sustainability master plan. This was a really important document to set goals along the lines of increasing recycling percentages, decreasing waste, getting rid of waste properly, increasing water conservation, increasing water quality, a lot of different things it helps set the path for. And then, of course, that plan is about a decade old. So last fall, we were given the go-ahead to update the plan, to develop a new plan and do an analysis and a development with our community on the current challenges we're facing and where we need to be going as a community, knowing what we know today. So the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan got underway last October, so we've been working on it for over a year. It's led by our city's Sustainability Steering Committee, actually not the city staff and the Sustainability Steering Committee. The steering committee is made up of some city staff and then about 20 community stakeholders from a variety of constituency groups who have a stake in this very issue. So there's people from energy, from Sioux Falls Public School District, from colleges. We have people from the development and business communities, environmental and community groups. So a lot of stakeholders putting this together and sort of leading the charge on this. And this is the group, our steering committee is the group who put together these focus areas of the plan. And I walked through these prior, but wanted to note that we'll be talking about the natural systems focus area. That's really where our water quality initiatives are housed at this point. So they've done a lot of work to put this together, set up the focus areas. And then we also had 2 phases so far of community engagement. to help develop our plan. So of course, we know when we're developing a community-wide plan, it's really important to reach out and work with our community members to make sure it captures the needs and the concerns of our community, as well as best practices and science-based targets that we have too. So this was the open house that was held in October, and one of our audience members was there. It was a really great event to talk with community members who were concerned or who are passionate about this issue, who wanted to take part in the formation of a plan that will help guide the cities and communities' efforts on sustainability for years to come. So that was in October. And then prior to that, in April, we held our sustainability community survey. And that was all April long. It was a digital survey. We had about 1,400 people take it. And our intent there was to understand what people were thinking about with sustainability. What were they concerned about? What were they troubled by? What were they angry about? We wanted to use that information to start developing a plan that was really community driven. And so we heard a lot of feedback from these two events, from these two community engagement events, and especially along the focus area of natural systems, particularly water. So when we talked with people about what they think of when they think about sustainability, we heard about our Big Sioux River a lot. People are concerned about it. People want us to do it and work on it to continue the forward momentum we have and to do even more. And so one of the questions we asked with the sustainability survey in April, it was an open-ended question, and we asked, is there anything else you think Sioux Falls should do to become more sustainable? And we heard a lot of responses, and by far and away, the biggest area we heard responses on was referring to the Big Sioux River, that we want to be prioritizing it more, we want to clean it up, we want to be listed as an impaired river. And so I wanted to show you a couple of the specific responses we heard. So one of the common types of responses we heard in this open-ended question was, clean up the Big Sioux River. Lots and lots of people, please just clean up the Big Sioux River, clean it up, get dirty, clean it up. And another one we heard was this: prioritizing river cleanup, partnering with entities upstream to reduce the pollution of our watershed. Our city's namesake is completely compromised. This should be an outrage and should be prioritized. I put this one on here because it captures some of the emotion and the frustration that we heard from some people. And I think it's valuable to know that those feelings exist in our community. We also heard, I'd love more transparency and focus on the Big Sioux River. I've kayaked and spent time on that water, and I'm also acutely aware of how much pollution and how dirty it is. Cleaner water would not only benefit habitat, it would benefit the community. And then finally, one more example. I love that Sioux Falls has focused a lot of time and energy on river cleanup, but there's certainly a long way to go. And I put this one on here because I think a lot of us who do work around natural resources and water resources may feel like this. We've done a lot, we've made improvements, but we do still have a long way to go. And I would agree with that sentiment. So with that, actually, before you read that, we used all these comments from the survey primarily, at the beginning of our plan development, to help shape our plan strategies and goals. So within each focus area, we identified several high-level goals and then strategies and tactics, very specific actions to help us make progress toward those goals. And our overarching goal for water quality was, or is, improve water quality and nature-based stormwater management. And so this whole slide is going to be me reading text on the screen, so apologies in advance. But I want you all to know, who are in this room, what we have developed as a city and community for where we want to focus on water. So the green is strategies, and then the white are specific tactics and actions. So our first strategy is to improve water quality throughout the Big Sioux River watershed. Continue partnerships with agencies to improve water quality throughout the watershed, and then develop and implement strategies to reduce bacterial load coming from Sioux Falls. This one is really focused on the watershed scale, our contribution as Sioux Falls to the work being done there, and then also the specific bacterial load that's coming from the community. Next, we have increased green infrastructure on city-owned properties. So we piloted demonstration green infrastructure project on drainage property. Hold educational opportunities at the pilot site. Work interdepartmentally to prioritize green infrastructure on city development projects and stormwater projects. Green infrastructure is something that plays a large role in our plan, and I'm just going to take a second to define that. So green infrastructure, when we're thinking about stormwater management, is kind of the opposite of what could typically be called gray infrastructure. So that's the concrete piping and man-made structures that carry our stormwater away from our community. Green infrastructure is using more nature-based solutions, as we note about on the goal, to help manage stormwater quantity and quality. So it's using things like rain gardens, more native plant landscaping that has deeper roots to draw stormwater deeper into the ground rather than turf grass that doesn't really infiltrate the water because of its shallow roots. It's using things like, retention and detention ponds. Those have that natural component to them. And then, rain gardens, green roofs. There's a whole smattering of approaches for green infrastructure that we want to be using more of, not only for stormwater management, but to bring about other benefits that we have. So when we have more green infrastructure in our city, we have more pollinator habitat. We have more green spaces for our community to enjoy and to benefit from the positive health impacts that they can bring. The clean air, they lead to more climate resilience. There's this whole host of things beyond stormwater management, and that's, there are many reasons why we want to be focusing on green infrastructure. And then lastly, increase green infrastructure community-wide to add nature-based solutions and resilience benefits. Oh, one other thing about green infrastructure. So it's in the water quality piece because it helps contribute to our water quality. So we are infiltrating our water more into our soils, which means we have less stormwater flowing down our streets, picking up pollutants, and then flowing into the river. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the key area there. All right. Increase green infrastructure community-wide to add nature-based solutions and resilience benefits. So this one is very community-oriented, whereas the prior one is on city-owned property. We want to assess and adopt city ordinances to promote green infrastructure, provide more education and technical assistance to the folks who are actually putting this in on the ground or who will be. Support and encourage all types, from a city perspective, whether that be with technical resources or linking people with the right resources. Communicate success stories, create a simple, justifiable pathway for developers, and then educate the public about green infrastructure and LID, and assist them in implementing practices. I do want to say here that our plan it's created and sort of housed with the city, but it is a community plan. And so not all of these tactics will be owned by the city. So thinking about this last one, to educate the public, assist in implementing green infrastructure practices. So there are many entities who would help with this. So we have our conservation district who is doing work on this, who could possibly provide technical resources and assistance for homeowners to put in rain gardens in their property, for example. So it's the city doing work, and it's also our community members, residents, and more. All right, so what we are working on now, specifically around water quality, I should say too. So we are currently doing quite a bit with water quality from the City of Sioux Falls perspective. Annually, we host our Big Sioux River Greenway cleanup. This is now done in the fall. It was done in the spring at the beginning, but it was canceled a couple of years due to flooding, so we kind of shifted into the fall. We had our 6th one this year, and with these 6 events total, volunteers have picked up about over 20,000 pounds of trash, debris, recycling. And that's a really huge deal because not only does it make sure that that material doesn't go in our immediate waterway, but if it goes in there, it will eventually lead to the ocean. I mean, it could. And so this is a way that we act locally and we act globally as well, which is really important, I think, to understand that connection. We also have the annual Storm Inlet Art Program, where local artists paint a water quality message on our storm drains. This is a really awesome program because it piggybacks off the really robust art culture in our downtown, and brings in this water quality message. And we've heard such great things from this. People are just walking downtown to a restaurant and they're seeing this beautiful art piece and water quality message, and it has a really big impact. We also hold educational events. This is the 2020 Water Festival, and that is where fourth graders come to learn all about water, water conservation, water quality. This is an activity that Troy and I actually were doing with students to teach them about non-point source pollution. This gutter is the river, of course, and it's a really cool activity that the kids love. And then we also have 2 environmental analysts who do a lot with protecting our water via construction sites and some other areas in the city. So they regulate and inspect construction sites to make sure that we have proper sediment control, to make sure sediment isn't going into our inlets and then into the river. They do a lot of other water quality work too. And then this is something that I'm really excited about. A lot of people on our team are excited about. These are designs for our green infrastructure project happening in Central Sioux Falls. So this left image is 28th Street and Coble Avenue, and then the right is 35th Street and Duluth. These are close to Augustana University. And we are just really excited. I'm really excited. I think everyone's excited that we're going to just have this really beautiful green infrastructure project to aid in stormwater management, but to also bring in native plants, to have this be an educational site for the local school that's nearby, Augustana students. It's just going to be awesome. So we're really excited about that. That it has the one on the left has already been constructed. The one on the right will be constructed in the spring. And then the planting, the native plants that will be coming, take a couple years to take hold and to grow. So stay tuned. That's very exciting. Oh, and the other thing here is that, actually, we'll get to that, sorry. And then one other thing with water quality is trees. So we know that trees in our urban forest have a lot to deal with stormwater management. So not only do they help infiltrate water, but they of course have those benefits beyond, like shade, community resilience, etc. We know with our emerald ash borer, we will be losing thousands of trees if people don't treat them. So the parks team is leading the charge on ensuring that our urban forest will be strengthened and diversified in the coming years to help with water quality and to help benefit. All right, future work. Water quality pilots. One of the things that we're going to be working on is with one possible initiative is with our keynote speaker, actually Dr. Block, who's doing some really interesting research around low cost tech to improve water quality. So a couple on our team are looking into that. We want to do more green infrastructure on city property, and then educate at those sites. So that pilot demonstrate or that pilot green infrastructure site that I showed, we want to use that and bring people in to showcase to not only students, but developers, designers. This is how this can work in our community. And then developing a pathway for developers to adopt and implement low impact design, thinking about how that might look in our engineering design standards and some of the ordinances that we have for how we build our community. I'm done. All right, that's it. And I know we're pretty much at time. So happy to answer questions. Reach out to me if you would like. I'm happy to connect on any of these things. So.
We've got time for a few questions if anyone has it.
It's nice to see the working with developers on low impact development. And so how many staff or what capacity with Sioux Falls exploding?
Right.
Can they keep up with that job?
Yeah, so you are referring to this piece?
Well, yeah,
or just broadly?
Teaching them about, more sustainable practices and not planting everything in Kentucky bluegrass.
Yeah.
Just so what a waste.
Yeah.
Maybe less Kentucky bluegrass, more more of the deeper rooted native grasses.
Yeah.
That I think people would enjoy seeing,
Right.
you know, native grass waving instead of golf course.
Right,
No.
yeah.
So who's all working with the developers? Are people taking that and,
Yeah.
you know, adopting new things?
Well, we're at the early phases of sort of putting a plan like that together. We have a handful of staff, of course, you know, capacity is tight as it is for everybody, but it is in our, you know, maybe 3 to 5 year range to develop a robust program where we can work more with developers, you know, provide technical assistance, go to the demonstration site. Yeah. But I mean, it's a challenge for capacity, but we know that we need to go that way.
Kind of related to that, is the city got any plans or maybe you don't see pilot work on permeable material with parking lots? Is there any-
Yeah, so that was actually brought up as a possibility with our green infrastructure project, possibly where we have this parking here. We went against it for a couple reasons. Some people have had some trouble with pervious pavement in the past, and so that kind of, you know, lingers, but it is an area that we've identified where we would like to try, especially in more parking areas and not roadways. Not yet. And we do, I think it's at the Arboretum, though. I think they have something at the Arboretum. I'm not sure, but
Yes, so it's
yeah. Okay.
parking area.
Yeah.
I think we just have to teach the public that their lawns don't have to be super manicured and hardly any grass. I mean, let stuff fly around and I'll bring pollinators in, the natives going.
Yeah, we heard that a lot from our sustainability survey and from the open house, that a lot of people want to have more native plants. There of course are some challenges with that. I personally agree. We have some challenges with that because there's this perception of the manicured lawn. There's this whole like research on the psychology of the lawn, and it's really deep. So that will be a challenge for us to work through, but there are a lot of opportunities and people wanting to do that. So hopefully once people start implementing that, it will kind of be a domino effect of that it is beautiful too.
In the big picture, not specifically one, but is there, are there any plans to improve public transportation in these problems?
Yeah, so that's a big one. Public transit is a big one. Our planning department is working very diligently on trying to assess the problems around public transportation. One of them is that our community, it loses money on public transit, and so it's hard to put investments in things that, you know, it's like a chicken or egg situation, kind of, you know, we don't have a ton of people riding public transit, but we know we need to improve it. There was the SAM on demand pilot, I don't know if you were aware of that, where it's kind of more like a Lyft Uber approach, where you can have a tap and you hail a smaller vehicle for public transit. They're looking into that, and I know that they're looking into some other possibilities of strengthening public transit, but it is certainly a need. Yeah. I don't know the answer, but yes, it is an area we're exploring.